Good morning. Welcome to our session on trauma-informed care. My name is Suzanne Smith, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Bureau of Education and Workforce Development. It's really my pleasure to be able to provide this information for you today. It was a bit of a challenge to determine, what would be the most important presentation to make in a very short time period. And what I determined was it made sense to go back to the basic presentation that was developed by Kevin Huckshorn as part of the National Association for Mental Health State Program Directors, and has been delivered as the foundation training for the trauma-informed care. This is a training that those of us in New York State who had the privilege to go to Maryland and receive this training received a few years ago, and this program was updated by Kevin Huckshorn in 2008. I know that some of you today really have had this information, and that those of you that have been participating in the learning collaboratives have received lots of information on trauma-informed care. So I hope that you'll see this as an opportunity to be a refresher, and a challenge for you today is to consider these slides as a summary of what you've learned so far, and that you will use this presentation to do a personal and agency assessment of how are we doing in making this information available to the rest of your organization. In thinking about this, I was thinking about in the 70s when we were trying to transition and change the culture of an agency to from a least restrictive environment to quality of life. And psychologist Mark Gold talked about a person lying flat on the ground, and six human service workers would run up to that person and lift him as far as they could off the ground, and we would say, look at the ground, see how far we've come with least restrictive environment. But if we took that same person and we turned them over and had them look at the sky, we would say, wait, this is how far we have to go for quality of life. And I think that we can make that same analogy here to trauma-informed care. We've come a ways, and some of you have come a long ways, and some of you maybe are not so far out of the ground. But as you review these slides, I hope you'll take this opportunity to celebrate the changes that you have made in your culture, and to consider whatever future changes might be needed. At the end of this session, we hope you'll be able to define trauma and trauma-informed care, to be familiar with the prevalence of traumatic life experiences in a variety of service settings, that will look at some characteristics of the trauma-informed and trauma-insensitive systems, and talk about the importance of trauma assessment. As you know from what you've heard so far, trauma is a game changer for people. It has lifetime effects on the person's identity, their life choice, and their coping mechanisms. And I also want to start out by saying that when we restrain or seclude a person who has a history of trauma, it really does become a moral issue for us. Our charge is to do no harm, and when we use restraint and seclusion, we are doing harm. We're going to revisit this a little bit later during the session. In terms of our outline, we're going to look at some definitions, again look at prevalence, and look at systems and assessment. So in training, we like to start with a pretest and look at where people are so that we can adjust our presentation to where people are. So we thought we'd start out with a little pretest here. So if you just take a sheet of paper and see if you can answer the questions here. At the end of the session, we'll take a look back and see if you got 100 the first time out, or if there was anything that you learned from this presentation. So we'll just take a minute and do that. Okay, in just a minute, we're going to look at a film clip. Of course, we aren't able to actually show a DVD on a webinar, but I really thought that it was an important aspect of a training on trauma-informed care that we start with a focus on real people that we are supporting in recovery. This is not a hypothetical issue, philosophical issue. This is about real people who have experienced horrific situations. And each of us participating today have a responsibility to learn more in order to enhance our ability to support individuals like the ones you're going to hear from in just a minute. The second issue is that I wanted you to know that this video is available at no charge, and the contact information is on the slide. Some of the state facilities I know are using this video now in their training, but I wanted to be sure that people knew that it was available and can be a helpful training tool. So it's just going to take us a minute to start playing, and again we're going to visit this DVD in the middle of it, and it may not start exactly on cue, but you're going to hear from some individuals who have experienced trauma, and you're going to hear about their experience in a system that was designed to help them deal with their trauma.
It's when I was raped when I was 12 by one of my dad's friends. To this day, my parents still don't believe me. And it hurts. I don't know whether it's because they're in denial that it happened, or they just think that I was promiscuous at 12 years old. I didn't even know about sex at 12. So I blame myself. All these years, I felt my life was taken from me. Because I allowed men, after that, to abuse me in any way, whether it was physical, mental, or sexual. Because I felt that how life was supposed to be like. I allowed it to happen when I was out on the streets. I suffered so much trauma out there on the streets with the rapes, the beatings, the stabbings, guns through my head. I went through some trauma when I was 12 because I got abused and raped. I just, cried a lot and didn't trust people. I kept it to myself. I didn't want to share with anybody because I thought that it was my fault. I came through the system when I was 16 years old. My father got killed. He got beat with a baseball bat. He got beat with a baseball bat on the corner at a bar. Some guys jumped him and beat him to death. Yeah, so that really traumatized me and took me through a lot. So they diagnosed me as bipolar. So that's all I kept hearing, that I was bipolar and I had a chemical imbalance. Throughout the years, I just been, in and out of institution. I shut down and there wasn't nobody there to, wasn't nobody there to talk to me or ask me what was going on. It was like on my own. I took the medicine figuring that was going to help me get by. I figured I'd sleep myself away and I'd be all right. It may sound crazy, but I stayed on there to get through it. I wasn't really feeling my own feelings and emotions because I was medicated up. I remember when I woke up, I was strapped. I didn't know where I was. Whatever medication they gave me had me knocked out for 3 days. I was laying in my own urine and my own feces. I still smell that same smell. They had me on Thorazine to feel an Ativan at the same time. They told me if I didn't take it that they were extending my isolation therapy. And I told the psychiatrist, I'm not taking that anymore. I don't like the way it feels. I visited my mother and I had to crawl back, literally crawl. So I started taking it. Because the isolation was so bad. I started taking it just to get off isolation.
I didn't want them to take me and put me back in some room, and I didn't want them to take me and put me with Thorazine, and I didn't want it. And it's an instantaneous effect for anybody who's never been injected with Thorazine. When they hit you with that long needle on your hip, you just instantaneously go out. And that's what happened to me a lot. I felt like I'm crazy. The rest of the world's okay, and I'm the one that's crazy.
I remember them laying me on the bed by force. I can recall maybe 6 between doctors and nurses, and they strapped my arms and my legs and around my waist area. I had a hard time with that because when I was raped, I was stripped, tied, gagged, and beat. had a fear of that happening all over again. Even though I was in a hospital under doctor's care. When I was willing to go, that's what I'm saying. They charged me, and they, they was examining me, and they was hitting me, and they were holding me down. And I remember hearing her say, "Hey, she's pregnant. She's pregnant." By that time I was already balled up on the floor, trying to block the blows, and they took me off to seclusion, to isolation.
And I was very used to people hurting me, physically hurting me. And I was very afraid. I was afraid. And especially when they came to rush me and grab me and pin me down on the floor and put my arm behind my back and then put me in isolation for 3 days and 4 days alone. That's a lot for a 13-year-old. That's a lot.
When you use force towards a person, it showed a person that, it's like you're dangerous, and it's not, I don't think it's not good to use force towards a person, Like I said, I think you should take time and just talk to a person and see where I'm at instead of putting your hands and throwing them around, because it makes them feel real bad inside. If you put your hands on them and try to restrain people, then that makes them want to fight, makes them want to fight back. So, they, that's all they know, to defend themselves.
Okay, I realize that that was pretty heavy to start a presentation in, but as I said, I think it's really helpful for us to think about what we're doing when we apply restraint and seclusion to someone who has experienced the kind of trauma that these young women had. And just so you know, if you're not familiar with this video, that these 4 women that you heard from are actually in an innovative program in Maryland called Tamar's Children, and it was designed from the start to be trauma-informed and to help new mothers with substance abuse, criminal, mental health, and trauma histories learn better self-care skills for themselves and their children. And at the end of the DVD, you'll see how well that they are doing. So what can we learn from the stories we have just heard is that we can do a better job, we have to do a better job to make our environments as sensitive as possible so that we, in fact, do no harm. And the 6 core strategies, of course, play a very vital role in helping us do that. So what happens when traumatized consumers are restrained or secluded? The bullets that you see on the screen, they felt that they were being punished, they were confused by staff use of force, they did not feel protected from harm, and feelings of bitterness and anger 1 year later. In a research study where children were asked about their recent hospital experience and asked to draw a picture about that, they did not draw pictures of, caring staff and, nice surroundings and activities where they were involved. They actually drew pictures most frequently of being restrained or secluded. So if we ask ourselves the question, what actually is trauma? We have the definition here that was adopted by Nashpin in 2004. I'm not going to read that to you. I think it's on your screen and everybody can read that. And then, of course, from the DSM-4, the person's response includes fear, horror, helplessness. But I think one trauma survivor actually expresses it much more clearly when she says, any experience that hurts you so bad that you never get over it. So the kinds of trauma that we're talking about, no one is going to argue that a one-time trauma experience is not going to lead to long-term issues. Of course, experiences as people have recently experienced as a result of earthquakes, tsunamis, and other hurricanes, and 9/11 situations like that, we know that one-time events can cause a lifetime of treatment issues and people needing support. But generally, when we talk about the trauma that people have experienced in our system, we'll find that this trauma is perpetuated by someone close, someone known to the victim, intentional, repeated, prolonged. And the earlier this happens, the more profound the impact on development, as we reviewed last week in the neurobiology trauma that David presented. So when we talk about what we mean by the definition of trauma-informed care, we have treatment that really incorporates an appreciation for the prevalence of trauma and understanding of the results of that trauma on the neurological, biological, psychological, and social effects and violence in an individual. In trainings, well, I don't know how many of you may have experienced the suitcases from Willard exhibit. If you did, you would see that when Willard closed, a number of suitcases were found that contained remnants of the individuals' lives who were admitted to Willard, and some of them, of course, were never left Willard. And I think sometimes it's helpful for us to think about the people coming into our systems, that they really bring with them their invisible suitcase. And those suitcases include their life story many times, and are filled with messages that they have heard over and over again about, I'm worthless, I'm always in danger, I am powerless. And with that, they also bring messages about you, that you are unresponsive, you are unreliable, that you are dangerous. And of course, another factor is that those of us who are providing support for individuals, we have our own suitcases, and we have our own invisible stuff that we bring with us, and how they interact, the two suitcases that we're bringing. So think about what's in the suitcase of the people that you're supporting. So we talked about what is the prevalence. I know that many of you have had some basic information on this already. I'm not going to teach all of these slides, but I did want to make them available because they really deal across service systems and the research about the prevalence of trauma. So some of you may be interested in pursuing that research a little bit more, but we're going to present these fairly quickly. So when we look at the research around adults, we will find that 90% of the public mental health clients have been exposed. In another study, 51 to 98%. Most are multiple experience of trauma. Again, in adults, we have some research from South Carolina. And South Carolina has done a good job with research and include trauma that occurs, what they call sanctuary trauma, and that is the trauma that occurs in systems that have allegedly been designed to support individuals but are actually places where lots of trauma occurs, such as you heard in the film clip that we just saw. This is a study about children. Substance abuse, juvenile justice systems. In this one, the last bullet, the 70% to 92% of incarcerated girls reported sexual, physical, or severe emotional abuse in childhood. That's pretty similar to what we would find in a psychiatric inpatient setting. In the research done by Gilligan and Garbarino, they talk about the impact of trauma on boys and the relationship of that to the antisocial behavior by regaining control through aggression. Since issues of shame are pervasive, that many times aggressiveness, violence are used to save face. And vigilantism could be seen as a survival strategy for these boys. And gang affiliation offers a new and better family. Lack of future orientation and sense of meaninglessness causes them to take risks. Some research describe a pathway in which exposure to violence and pervasive feelings of not being safe develop into a state of chronic threat, requiring the youth or adult to use physical aggression in order to manage. So So this research talks about the correctional system. And I was reminded of my experience as a younger family services counselor in a prison where I had had no training in what trauma informed care was, what the impact of trauma was, and I was talking with a man who was sentenced to 6 to 8 years for very violent crimes and drug sales. And he was talking about a situation that he remembered when he was 4 years old, and he was hiding under the bed from his mother, who had been chasing him with a pair of scissors and saying that when she caught him, she was going to kill him with the scissors. And at that point, he broke down sobbing, and I'm going to admit that I also broke down sobbing at that point. Today, I understand what that was all about, but as a young family service counselor, I really did not understand. And today, I also understand the impact of that vicarious traumatization, compassion fatigue, and why that vision of that young child hiding under the bed haunted me and came into my thoughts frequently. But we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. In the population of individuals with intellectual impairment or developmental disabilities, this group is a particularly vulnerable group. We see that sexual abuse incidents are 4 times as common. We believe it's to be underreported. And there appears to be a strong relationship between the victimization and later offending. So people with developmental disabilities are exposed to trauma and abuse more frequently than other people based on the research. So what does this prevalence data tell us? Why is it significant? Is that the majority of the adults and children that we're supporting have trauma histories. And also children and adults served in other settings. Many people with trauma histories have overlapping problems, so it's not just PTSD that we're talking about. We're talking about overlapping problems with other mental health issues, substance abuse, physical health. Need to use universal precautions, that we need to assume that the people that we are supporting in our settings are trauma survivors. So other trauma findings, there was a study of adverse childhood conditions, that there are other physical results of trauma, not just mental health issues, but there are major health issues, health risk behaviors that are used as coping mechanisms, such as eating disorders, smoking, substance abuse, self-harm, promiscuity, and resulting in early death. I think this diagram really displays that a little better. So typical trauma-related symptoms. If you're reading this and you have a great experience with this, add to this list, and you can email us later about things that we should be including on this slide. This is a list of things that we may say typically see. But as you learned in David's presentation last week, with people with traumatic experience may have difficulty functioning with a level of optimal arousal and demonstrate symptoms of either hypo or hyperarousal. Hypoarousal, of course, being demonstrated as numbing, disassociation, flattened effect, withdrawal, disconnection. Hyperarousal symptoms demonstrate that continued emergency state of fight or flight, including flashbacks, terror, hypervigilance. The point we want to make with this is that these symptoms are really not a sign of pathology. They're really survival strategies that have helped people cope with the terrible pain and challenges. The key for us is to learn how they developed and how we can help people learn new coping strategies. To begin our trauma-informed care, we need to start with assessment, where we learn as much as we can about what the trauma was, what the impact is. So we start with advanced directives, safety plans. We do use our tools to determine what the de-escalation preferences are, and we use them in day-to-day. Individuals should not have to disclose trauma histories in order to receive trauma-informed care. Now wait, you say, then what if? What if we have people who really don't have a trauma history? What do we do with those individuals? What kind of treatment would be appropriate for them? And the good news for you is that trauma-informed treatment is actually optimal treatment for anyone, but it's required for people who are trauma survivors. And so we actually need to presume that everyone in the treatment setting has been exposed and provide treatment that takes that into consideration. So what are some key principles for assessment? We use it to identify the past or current trauma. What is the effect of the trauma on daily life? What are the contexts for the current symptoms that we're seeing? And that guides us to our clinical approaches. Sandra Bloom talks about focusing on what happened to you, not what's wrong with you. And we need to do this assessment upon admission or shortly afterwards. Minimally, an assessment should include what the type of trauma was, what is the age, and who was the perpetrator. Lack of safety in a hospital, at home, or community, or residence or other treatment setting must be assessed. I'm going to move on now to what are we talking about with trauma-informed care. When we talk about trauma-informed care, what do we really mean by that? We throw the term around a lot. Trauma-informed care is informed by research and evidence. We just don't do what we think is the right thing to do, but we look at the research and we learn from it and we put it into practice. It is supported by all of the national guiding documents, including the Surgeon General's report, the New Freedom Commission, and the Institute of Medicine. It's evidence-based. What do they look like? I want to go back to that slide for just a minute. That recognition of coercive interventions. This is a term that we're going to talk a lot about when we talk about what does trauma-informed care really mean. When we talk about coerciveness, how would we define that? And if you look it up in the dictionary, it says something like one person having power over another person and brings about action by domination. And we're not talking about physical power always. Sometimes it is physical power, but we're really talking about an unequal distribution of power in the relationship, so that one party actually has power over another person. Our goal in trauma-informed care is really to have power with the person that we're supporting. And our goal is to mitigate the effects of trauma by providing that person-centered, recovery-oriented support and avoiding any practices that could cause any further trauma. So when we talk about what a system looks like, what does a trauma-informed system look like? So in a minute you're going to see a short video, you're going to hear another short video clip. And it's going to start very quickly, and you are going to hear from a setting that is not trauma-informed for a minute. And then you're going to see a review of that with an environment that's more trauma-sensitive. Okay, so we just need to go to chapter 2. It'll go if you just click that.
Listen, wait with me.
So
The young woman told me that their affection and obvious delight in each other helped her.
They had a lot of restraints before that.
We can view seclusion and restraint as not treatment, but treatment failures. Thank you for helping us achieve this humane goal.
Okay, I don't know how to...
Hey,
yeah.
where are you going?
Man, this group is a boring group.
Sit
We should be
down.
on.
I don't care.
You know what?
You have to
I'm
sit
getting
down
out of
now.
here. I'm not taking your medication anymore.
We have
I'm
rules
not taking
here.
that. I don't care about your rules.
Care what you
I
care.
don't
We have
care about
rules.
your rules.
You
Get
sit
your
down.
hands open. I don't have to
We
sit down
have rules
anywhere.
here.
Get your hands off
You are
of
going
me.
to go. I'm
Get your
here,
hands
you're
off
going
of
to
me. I don't
go
care.
to
You can do
seclusion.
what you want to do. You better get
Somebody
your hands
call
off of me.
security.
Call you want to call.
now.
I'm getting out of this hospital.
Good
morning, everybody. Good morning. And welcome to Recovery Group this morning. Today, what we're going to be talking about is what recovery means to each and every one of you.
And the food is terrible here. It's boring here. I can't stand it anymore. The food tastes horrible. I'm tired. I'm getting out of this hospital. I'm getting out of this hospital, and I'm not taking that medication anymore. I'm not taking anything anymore. I don't want to be here. I mean, you just don't understand. I just don't want to be here anymore.
I understand.
You don't understand. You don't understand.
I understand you're not wanting to be here.
No, you don't understand. You don't know what the medication does to me. I haven't had any sleep, and it makes my mouth dry.
But you know what? Maybe we can go and sit down and talk about it. Maybe we can have something to drink. Huh? You know, and then maybe you and I can talk to the doctor together, maybe?
Okay.
Okay. All right. You tell me all about it. You know?
Okay, so in that first session, you saw a trauma not informed system. And then they redid it again with using trauma-informed practices. And we could talk about could they have even done it better in the second scenario. Certainly the first one we heard a lot of, we have rules, get back here, call security. And the next one we're trying to figure out what is the issue? Why does this person want to leave the group training session? So again, this video is also available to you at no charge from the SAMHSA website, and you may find it helpful to use in your training programs. So in the next few slides, we're going to look at trauma-informed systems versus trauma systems that are not trauma-informed. I'm not an expert in designing assessment tools, but I thought for those of you who have some background, or even for those who don't, that you will take this opportunity to assess yourself using a scale of 5 to 1. So that 5 means we're doing a great job with that, we really do feel that we are trauma-informed. And 1, we're going to give everybody a 1 just for being on this webinar today. So if you're here, you're going to get at least a 1. And if you're somewhere in the middle, so let's think about this and look at your own program settings and think about how are we doing. So trauma-informed, we recognize the high prevalence. We are doing assessment, and we recognize the culture and practices that are re-traumatizing. In this one, we're talking about power and control, and in trauma-informed settings, that those are minimized, that we don't see a lot of keys and uniforms and staff demeanor that have the tone that we are the ones in charge here, that there's much more of a collaborative environment in a trauma-informed setting, that staff are not rule enforcers that we would see in a non-informed setting. Patient blaming is the norm in a non-informed setting. I think an interesting example of patient blaming that came up, I actually think it was one of the calls that I thought was really interesting, and that was a program area that had a big celebration because they were working with a patient who had not had to be restrained or secluded in a 1-month period, and they provided this person with a certificate and said, you know, what a good job you've done by not having to be restrained. And in that case, we really are blaming the patient a little bit, aren't we? Saying that, you know, you had to be restrained, instead of why don't we celebrate staff who made really good decisions and used great problem-solving skills and worked really hard to avoid the restraint and seclusion. So maybe we should be celebrating the staff's choice there, rather than saying to the patient, you're the one that's doing well because you haven't caused us to have to put hands on in a month. Laura Prescott talks about her experience in a non-trauma informed system, and she talks about how unsafe the environment felt with large men and loud voices and keys displayed and doors locked. This is a woman who had been locked in her room and repeatedly abused by her father. And it's late evening when this is the time she was typically abused, and a staff member comes into her unit and yells, then another man with keys on his belt, and so she was triggered and re-experienced the abuse. And to manage, she finds a paperclip and starts digging into her skin, and when she does this, 3 men jump on her to restrain her and put her in 4 points. Alternatively, at times she gets triggered due to the bedtime procedure again, and she will start to pace, and the nurses approach her, and she grabs a paperclip and starts to cut into her skin, and the staff in the trauma-informed system try to talk to her about what she might use as a calming strategy and what they could do to help. Sometimes, even when we've made progress with our trauma-informed systems, we still use our tools in a way that's a bit coercive in terms of if a person has identified a calming strategy and staff are saying, yeah, if drawing is something you like to do, you need to finish what you're doing here with us right now. We need you to finish that, and when you do that, you'll be able to draw because that's part of your calming strategy. Well, if it's a calming strategy, that's something a person chooses to do when they need it. They don't have to jump through the hoops that we develop for them in order to gain the benefit of that. We look at all behavior has meaning, and we would illustrate this by a little bit that we'll call Sammy, and Sammy refuses to stay at bed at night, and Sammy would always create some kind of crisis so that he would end up not having to stay in his bedroom, and that he would eventually be moved to a common area, and as soon as he was moved to the common area, he would probably promptly fall asleep and was only able, it seems, to be able to sleep at that time. If non-trauma informed, we would say that, he's non-compliant, he refuses to stay at bed at night, he's always creating crisis, and we would look at that instead of looking at, what is this behavior and what is the meaning that it has. And when we find out, again, that Sammy was a child who was abused at nighttime, we can help figure out some ways to help Sammy remain safe and design a routine that will work for him. In this slide you have the labeling of language that we do a lot, and we hear a lot about clients, patients who are manipulative, they're needy, they're attention seeking. We see that a lot in written reports. And I just want to ask you, people that are listening to this call, have you ever paid a compliment to a person in higher authority in order to be seen in a more positive light with that person? Are you shaking your head no? Does that mean that I'm actually the only one that's ever done that? Because really that's manipulative behavior. You're trying to act in a way that you're going to get something back for that. How about this one then? Have you ever arranged a doctor appointment at 1 o'clock in the afternoon so you can actually be a little closer to your son's soccer game that night? How about suggesting a location for a meeting that puts you on the expressway ahead of traffic? Yeah, you know what I call that? I call it manipulation. It is not really a dirty word. It's behaving in a way that we get our needs met. And sometimes it's a necessary behavior. In an example from Risking Connections, one person said, I was in pain and I cut myself. And I got labeled a manipulative borderline. But no one asked me about how I felt. Being called manipulative felt like when my mother used to taunt me and call me a baby if I cried when she beat me. If I knew what I needed, I wouldn't be here. We also look at attention seeking as a negative word, and I think all of us have a need for attention. And those of you that tell a joke at a staff meeting when you come into work, what are you doing that for? Is it about attention? I think so. So attention seeking is, again, not necessarily a horribly negative thing. When we look at language, I think that's where we can do a lot of work in our assessment. What does our language sound like? And I'm going to ask you as homework throughout today to listen to what language we're using, and that hopefully in your work teams that you'll develop a strategy with people you work with to catch you on it when you use something that's not trauma informed, when we don't hear positive language or we start to label. Just the other day I heard somebody talking about the bipolars or the borderlines, and I'm like, really? I thought we were beyond that now, that we would label a group of people. So let's make an agreement that we will all catch ourselves when we hear language that is not trauma-informed, and that we refer to people as people who may live with a mental illness. And better yet, why don't we ask people what they would like to be called? So trauma-informed language, when we hear people yelling lunch or get in line, medications, if I have to tell you one more time, step away from the desk, please. So what would we observe? What would the environment look like? If you think about the entrance to your program site, if you were entering that with a loved one that may have to stay in this environment for a while, what would you feel about how welcoming the entrance looks to you? What about all of the tasks when you enter there, and all of the checks and all of the environmental cues? What's going on there? Are people greeting you warmly? Are they making eye contact? And then in your day-to-day programs, are people making contact? Do they say good morning? We've been doing a lot of training in respect around the state for some of our state psychiatric centers, and I'm really finding that in some settings the staff aren't even saying hello and good morning, and really there's an impact on that. If you are receiving services in a system where the staff don't treat each other well, there's an impact on that, and that's why I really love Maggie Bennington Davis' focus of trauma-informed care as really being a customer service program. In OMH, we do some training in customer service, and we use the FISH principles, and I really think they apply to trauma-informed care. Choose your attitude. We can choose whether we see behavior as a manipulative behavior or as a survival skill. We can remember that people are bringing their invisible suitcases with us, and why. To be there, build relationships, partnerships, make their day, focus on positive, celebrate success, and I think this is something we don't do well enough, is to help people find their joy. What are things that they enjoy doing and bring joy into their lives? Share some funny stories and laugh together. We learn that how we treat staff really does have an impact on the environment and whether or not it's trauma-informed or not. Viktor Frankl talks about that which is to give light must endure burning, and I just wanted to make a quick pitch for understanding the impact of working with trauma survivors. And in my training on compassion fatigue, this is a slide that we use, and I really just wanted to insert it into this presentation to talk about that as caregivers, we also need to pay attention to the staff and what they're experiencing in their day-to-day interactions with people as they hear stories and read records and understand the horrible trauma that many of the individuals have experienced that they are supporting. And I think that we can take a lesson from our airlines with that. And when the oxygen masks come down, we're always told that adults take the oxygen first so that they can provide support to those that they are responsible to. And I think that's something that we don't really spend quite enough time with our staff, is looking at what you need to do in order to be able to continue to do this work. So what does trauma-informed treatment look like? The focus is on safety, stabilization, and self-management. We need education, and we need access to experts, and I think that's one of the marvelous outcomes of the Learning Collaboratives, is that we have had a chance to hear from some folks who have really done well with this and can learn from this. In just a minute, we're going to have some time for questions. So here's some promising practices. Here's a website where you can get some more information. Some core elements of effective treatment programs are identified in this slide. Okay, and just for the last couple of minutes, I don't know when you were growing up, when I was growing up, my mother always said, mind your P's and Q's, and I think that really we can describe trauma-informed care with basically P's and C's in this case. So I'd like you to think about all the words that start with P that really describe trauma-informed care, and then some words that begin with C. So you just take 30 seconds to do that. Some P's that I had were person-centered, problem-solving, partnerships, power with, positive focus, praise, peer support, protect, person control, psychoeducation, presumed trauma, proactive. Some C's that I had were collaborative, choice, culture change, coordinate, customized, customer-focused, customer service, communication, coercive-free, compassionate. If we go back to our pre-test, you can fill in the blanks now. We focus on what happened to you instead of what's wrong with you. Practices are informed by evidence and research. Include persons served as a partner in the treatment. Eliminate practices that are coercive, and presume that every person that you're serving has experienced trauma. It's a summary slide. I just want to end with two most important two-letter words, I think, with trauma-informed care is, if it is to be, it is really up to me, that one person can really make a difference. We've talked about the importance of leadership and data, but really each of us have the opportunity to do better with this. There was a story about one direct care worker who got sent to a training on trauma-informed care and actually the 6 core strategies. And she came back on the following Monday after she'd been away at the training, and she immediately made an appointment with the CEO, and she insisted on talking with him, and made the appointment and went up and said, you know what, we're going to do things differently around here, and really change the culture of that organization. And as Margaret Mead said, never doubt that a small group of committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it really is the only thing that ever has. So I thank you, and if you have questions, you can send them in.
Yes, these slides will be made available at the end of all 8 webinars.
Okay, we have a couple more minutes if you want to send it in. Okay, so the name of the DVD, there were 2 DVDs. The one is Leaving the Door Open. It's available through the SAMHSA website, so if you just go to the SAMHSA website, you can search for it. And the other one is Behind Closed Doors, which again is also available through the SAMHSA website. And then if you get the slides later, there is some contact information on that as well, where you can get it directly from the source. But both are available through the website. If you have any issues getting it, you can email us at OMH, and we'll be able to give you some more information. While we're waiting for some questions to come in, maybe we could participate in a activity to change some coercive statements into more collaborative ones. So how about, here's a statement that we hear a lot. Everybody line up, it's time to go to dinner. No talking when we're walking. Is there a different way that we could say that that's a little more collaborative? And that might be, we'll be going to dinner in a few minutes. Remember, we must walk through the halls quietly because there are some people working. Can some of you share with the new staff some of the ways that we try to be respectful when we're walking to dinner? This, of course, is used with children. Okay, the question is, what can staff do to renew their strength at work after having been traumatized? And I think that we need to think about what our own comfort rituals. You know, we talk about what things help people we're supporting, calm down, calming strategies. I think that we really need to develop our own, and that we need to think about what nourishes us, what's in our well, what are things where we do get enjoyment, and that we need to practice those more. You really cannot go through a whole day that when you are really hearing stories, like the stories that you hear and work in the environments that you're working in, and expect, not to have it take a toll on yourself. So whatever it is for you, whether it's taking a nice long walk, if you have the ability to have a massage once in a while, or do some things that you find that are nourishing for you. Okay, while we're waiting for more questions to come in, we'll have another coercive statement that we could rewrite. Are you questioning my authority? And a trauma-informed response might be, from the way you responded, it sounds like I might have been too forceful when I told you to stop watching TV. Lynette, if we're going to make the movies in time, we need to leave now. I know you wanted to go. Do you still want to go, or do you want to stay and watch the program? Here's another one. If you don't take your medication, you will lose your privileges. More trauma-informed would be, I'm really concerned about you feeling good. Do you think your medication is not working? Is it making you feel bad? Is there something that we should know about how you're feeling when you take the medicine? Okay. I want to thank you for your attention today at the webinar. As was indicated, these will be available for you to have and use. If you have other questions, if you want to email them in, I'm sure that we will make an attempt to get back to you with a response. Thank you again. Have a great rest of the day.